Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us in our continuing series on embedded racism here at Vermont Law School. I'm Stephanie Clark, Director of the Center for Justice Reform at VLS. I teach ethics and restorative justice, clemency, pardon, and expungement. I use pronouns she, her, and I'm delighted to be your moderator this evening. I want to first start by just expressing gratitude, first to our student ambassadors who are behind the scenes. So Mariana, Taylor, and Ariel, thank you. And technical assistants, Emily and Rick, thank you. And of course, to Jean Shirley Jefferson, because she is responsible for bringing the series to fruition. Also, just a couple housekeeping items before we begin. You can post questions in the chat when we do the Q&A session at the end. And you'll see on the live stream in the top right-hand corner, there's a little icon. That is one place you can enter questions. You can also enter questions on our Facebook page. So now I'd like to introduce, actually one other thing, we have a QR code that you'll notice. We have some questions for you this evening because we'd like to engage with our audience. So if you scan that QR code using your smartphone, we'll have some questions for you in a bit. So now let me introduce our panelists for this evening. The first is Commissioner Shaleen Title. She's with the Cannabis Control Commission in Massachusetts. Commissioner Title is an attorney. She was jointly appointed to her position by the governor, the treasurer, and the attorney general in Massachusetts. In 2018, Boston's Business Journal named Commissioner Title one of the 50 most powerful persons in Boston for her advocacy work for women and persons of color in the context of drug policy reform and industry. When serving as a board member for the Minority Cannabis Business Association, she drafted the first model bill for states on drug reform and policy, focused specifically on reinvestment and reconciliation. She's also consulted nationally on marijuana legalization. Welcome, Commissioner Title.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Professor Robert L. Sand. He was state's attorney here in Windsor County, Vermont for over 15 years. During that time, he initiated and helped launch the first DUI treatment court. He also served as the governor's liaison for criminal justice programs. He's the founder of our Center for Justice Reform and our Master of Arts in Restorative Justice program. He's a VLS graduate and a longtime professor of criminal law and other courses at VLS. Welcome, Professor Sand.
Thank you, Professor Clark.
And our other panelist this evening is attorney Anton Robinson from the Vera Institute. Attorney Robinson was a public defender in New York City for years before joining the Vera Institute. During his time with Vera, he has helped achieve broad bail reform in New York City. He remains with Vera, but I'm pleased to share that Attorney Robinson also serves now as a faculty adjunct member in our VLS Master of Arts in Restorative Justice program. He is currently teaching the class he also designed, Race, Crimes, and Restorative Justice. Welcome, Attorney Robinson.
Thank you, Professor Clark.
So now to our audience, this is the opportunity where we'd like to get to know you just a little bit. So please, we ask you to scan the QR code, and that's going to take you to a poll. So we can learn just a little bit about particularly how big is our circle and a little bit about who you are. We'll wait just a moment for the poll to load. And I think we just need to run the play on the poll. So lots of people on the East Coast this evening, and some people as far away as the Pacific Coast. So now why don't we go to our next question? So what is your weather today? Ooh, sunny and delightful. Wow. Cloudy but warm. I will say I'm relieved to know it's not snowing somewhere yet. Windy. It's windy here. Why don't we go to our next question? Now that we know it's sunny and delightful most places today for our audience. So do you prefer coffee or tea? Ooh. And I will just share that I had coffee this morning and then a cup of herbal tea.
Pick a side.
Looks like we have some strong coffee drinkers. How about our next question? Are you an early bird or a night owl? Oh, this is a tougher decision. I should ask the panelists, are you early birds or night owls?
I'm
I
voting.
was a night owl, and then after having a child, I became an early bird.
Still a night owl, for sure.
This is an even split.
Early.
I'm an early bird. So let's go to our next question. So which movie genre is closest to your go-to from the list below? Documentary, historical fiction, action adventure, romantic comedy, or drama? And I'll take this opportunity to ask our panelists, what was the last movie that you watched? And I'll let whoever wants to start.
If Bill Street could talk, it was just a beautifully shot movie. I love the imagery, obviously sad themes, but that's I know it feels a little cheeky to say it in our current context that that's the last movie that I saw, but it is, and it's a beautifully shot movie.
The last movie I watched was The Social Dilemma, a documentary on Netflix. And it was a little white male centric for my taste, but it was definitely worth watching. I think it's something everybody should watch.
My students in criminal law know this, that my go-to movie, which is the best movie in the history of American cinematography, is Talladega Nights, The Ballad of Ricky Bobby. So that was my go-to.
And it looks like our audience, wow, documentaries and drama. So we have one more question, and this next question for our audience is going to help us, is going to ground us really in the conversation that we're about to have this evening. And so I'd like our audience to reflect a little bit on the next question. And that is, how often do you speak directly with others about racism, racial discrimination, oppression, and privilege? Thank you. So I want to thank the audience for sharing a little bit with us so we have some understanding of who you are and where you are. And I also just want to especially thank you for answering this last question, because we hope in asking this question that whatever your response is, you will reflect whether you're doing the work you want to be doing as it relates to racial discrimination, and that you'll continue to ask this question because this work is for all of us, collectively and individually. So to get us started, I want to frame our conversation by mentioning a little bit about restorative justice and embedded racism. So sharing a few thoughts on restorative justice, I'll begin by acknowledging and honoring the Indigenous cultures who have shared their learning for our understanding of restorative justice and how it informs our conversation tonight. Restorative justice is not something that can be co-opted as a form of applied practice. Instead, it really culminates as a philosophy or a way of being. It is about recognizing we are who we are because of our relationships, past, present, and future, and that we are better through our connectedness. Restorative justice is also, I think, widely or more understood as a way to address harm and conflict and provide an opportunity for true healing and accountability. And I use the word opportunity intentionally because it is not for everyone or for every situation, and it cannot be compelled. So, to mention a few things about embedded racism as it exists in our country. In the Little Book of Race and Restorative Justice, Fania Davis, activist, lawyer, author, inspiration, describes 3 levels of racism in the United States. And the first is structural racism that exists in our very governance, and it has since the inception of our country. The next is institutional racism. And this can be seen in the policies and practices in all of our institutions. So schools, the healthcare system, our legal system. And it's these policies and practices that have systemically disadvantaged people of color while giving advantage to white people. The last is individual racism. And this includes explicit and implicit racial bias. And racial bias is particularly insidious because it drives our unintended behaviors. And this is one of the reasons why what we're doing is systemic. So to quote Fania Davis in her book, she says, "While the nation abolished slavery, the racial terror at its essence continues to haunt us. We are caught in history's pain, living it again and again." So reflecting on this pain and whether restorative justice can help address racial discrimination in the United States and help us move forward from our history to a place of healing and reparations, it's crucial to first acknowledge restorative justice as a movement has historically ignored race and racial discrimination. There is now a growing awareness of this missed opportunity and recognition of the urgent need for transformation in understanding racial discrimination at all levels, and what restorative justice may offer to heal and move forward. So our panelists tonight will share with you information across different dimensions of our legal system and discuss the impacts of these dimensions on people of color. And we'll also explore whether and how restorative justice plays a role in these dimensions to help move us forward. So with that, again, welcome to our panel. And I'll turn first to Commissioner Shaleen Title. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Clark. I want to thank you, Professor, on this distinguished panel. I also want to thank the student ambassadors and my colleague at the Cannabis Control Commission, Christopher Smith, who is a VLS alum and president of the Alumni Association, for connecting me to this panel. Christopher has proven himself to be a great cannabis regulator. And I will say in advance, if other VLS students and alumni have his kind of commitment to a safe, equitable cannabis market, I really want to pitch to you the opportunity to get involved in the cannabis practice of law and the government regulations as well. It's a really great way to make an impact in something that is totally new. So I encourage you to think about that. So my presentation today is about reinvestment and reconciliation with communities that have been disproportionately harmed by the drug war through the legalization of cannabis, which is an amazing opportunity and a massive, massive challenge that I feel we are very much in the middle of. And it's really a history-making opportunity that we're in. So back in in 2015, I was on the board of the Minority Cannabis Business Association after having worked on several cannabis legalization campaigns and in the movement to legalize marijuana. And we had largely been focused on criminal justice up until that point and the racial disparities in marijuana arrests. And we were focusing on how if you legalized cannabis, you would stop those arrests and essentially stop the disparities as it relates to the arrest, which has happened. But what we were learning was after the first states passed legalization, not only did the disparities continue, so the arrests went way, way down, but the racial disparities continued in the arrests that were made. And we were seeing that there was total inequality and a lack of economic justice in who was making money off of cannabis, a lot of money off of cannabis, largely white corporate interests compared to who had been harmed. Largely Black and Latino communities, well documented all across the country, really no exceptions. And so we were attempting to put together with these communities at the forefront of decision making, a bill, a model bill that would provide for restorative justice in different ways. The main three ways are first, reinvestment of tax revenue. So whether or not a community is interested in marijuana, the business, the licensing, if that community has been harmed, using the tax revenue that comes in to make up for the government's past harms. And I'll pause there and say, you know, after 3 years of working as a cannabis regulator here in Massachusetts, I've definitely observed a phenomenon or a myth that I don't believe in at all, which is that government is so small, incompetent, doesn't have enough resources, that we have to depend on big business to save us. And I absolutely reject that. I think that if we were able to run and create this war on drugs that created so much devastation across generations, that we also have the resources to fix it as well. And so I think we need to be very bold in how we seek to address those harms. So number one was reinvestment. Number two is addressing the existing drug war disparities that have continued after legalization. So for example, in Colorado, we saw that after legalization, the arrests of Black and brown young people actually went up because of the way that the 21 plus law was enforced. So here in Massachusetts and in other states, we have addressed that by making sure that there's decriminalization in place for youth between 18 and 21. So making sure that we're expunging records and we're otherwise focused on the criminal justice aspects. And then the third is that economic justice. So people are making billions of dollars from marijuana sales. It's essentially recession proof. We're seeing there's ready-made demand. There is a large existing underground illicit market that has been targeted in some communities and not others. And so the goal is to make sure that both ownership and jobs are going to interested members of those harmed communities. So those are like the three big picture aspects of what we were trying to do with the bill. So this was 2015. It was quite groundbreaking at the time, but I would say it's out of date now. The Massachusetts bill that was written at that time is out of date. And I think that is good news because we have made so much progress in the conversations that we've had in the past 5 years about this topic. You could say, like, what does talking matter, right? It's results that matter. But it really does matter, both in the way that people talked about marijuana and legalization in general, and the way that we now talk about our understanding of the drug war and racial justice. It has meant that every state, I think largely that has legalized cannabis, has made sure to emphasize racial justice. And so there is a lot of political will and an opportunity to put pressure on regulators like myself and make sure that we are implementing these laws in an equitable way. So I will briefly go through what the program looks like in Massachusetts and how it's turning out. So the benefits of the equity program that we created, and let me quickly pause and explain the structure of our agency, because it's actually very similar to the new independent agency that will be created under Vermont's legalization law. We are totally independent. There's 5 of us, and we were appointed jointly by the governor, attorney general, and treasurer in 2017 for expertise in public health, public safety, government regulation, business, and my seat, which is social justice. And I can't recommend that model enough. It is very difficult to start an agency from scratch, but there's also so much independence and opportunity to do things the right way. And when you are appointed by all of these different officials, there's no political or little political influence compared to if you were under an office. So together, the 5 of us built from scratch a regulatory structure. We began hiring staff. We now have around 100 staff that do an amazing job regulating cannabis. And in order to do it in an equitable way, we built this equity program. So you are eligible if you have a drug conviction or if you are from a geographic area that our data has shown was disproportionately targeted by arrests and incarceration under the drug war. If you qualify, you can get technical assistance if you're looking for a job or if you're looking for ownership through an application. There are license caps so that if you're not in the equity program, you can't, and nobody can dominate the market. There are 3 licenses maximum that you can hold. And then the newest benefit for equity program participants is exclusive access to certain types of licenses, specifically delivery. So for 3 years, if you want to own a delivery license in Massachusetts, you have to qualify under one of these programs, showing that you will benefit disproportionately harmed communities. So how has it gone? We only have 2 Black-owned cannabis businesses in Massachusetts that are operating. One opened back in March, and one actually opened today. There are a lot more in the pipeline, but I'm glad that I can say this to you all, being in a state where it's sort of like I'm coming from a time machine, because you're where we were when we first passed our legalization law. There are enormous challenges, and it's a good way to look at it when you look at the 3 types of racism that Professor Clark just outlined. When you're thinking about cannabis businesses licenses, it's just like everything else. There's structural, institutional, and individual racism. And our businesses, even though we are mandated under the law to encourage them and include them, and we've created several regulations to do so, they face discrimination and systemic bias in investment, real estate, local zoning, local control, and it's also on top of the stigma that comes with working in a business that's federally illegal and drug related. So that's like the big picture of where we are. I would say that the restorative justice process really started with acknowledging first that it was the government that created these harms, that we recognized it, that we wanted the people who were harmed to be at the table. And we then have continuously taken their comment in terms of the challenges that they're facing and addressed them one by one, because there's no magic bullet that's going to create those 3 buckets. You have to really systematically address them, and it's ongoing and it's challenging. We're just wrapping up another public comment period today. But I think when you have gone through that process and you continuously go through that process of acknowledging the harm that you've caused, and showing that you're listening to the feedback you're getting, that's the most important thing, because then you have the credibility to keep that relationship going. I always tell people, and this may come in handy for those of you who want to be involved with how legalization is implemented in Vermont, to think about it as a long-term relationship with your regulators. You don't want to burn a bridge over nothing. You want to show them what is important to you as a constituent and continuously give feedback and hold them accountable. And I think that this is a really interesting new area of law where that is actually possible. So I think I'm at my 10 minutes, so I will hold it there. Thanks again for the opportunity to talk about this.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Title, and I certainly have questions that we'll come back for. And now we will turn to Professor Sand.
Thank you so much, Professor Clark. It's an honor to be on this panel with Commissioner Title and Professor Robinson. Thank you to the student ambassadors and to Emily Potts and Rick Floyd for helping with technical aspects of the evening, and especially to Dean Shirley Jefferson for just being extraordinary. So I want to talk about the perils of prosecutor discretion and how that has a bearing on restorative justice efforts. And I hope that I will bring to bear my 22 years as a prosecutor to this discussion. So we hear lots of people who say that mandatory outcomes in the criminal justice system are wrong. Whether that's a mandatory minimum, some requirement that upon conviction a person serve a pre-specified period of time before they're eligible for release or for parole. And folks say that mandatory maximums, whether as part of a 3-strike law or perhaps in homicide law where there might be a mandatory life sentence, folks say we can't know without looking at the individual crime, without looking at the individual person who committed the crime, what the appropriate outcome is. We should dispense with mandatory sentencing. And I agree with that. But what happens when you remove mandatory sentences? That means that the outcomes are discretionary. And who is the individual within the criminal justice system who has the broadest, most unreviewable discretion? It is the prosecutor. Now, prosecutors will say that by virtue of their discretion, they're able to shape and tailor and craft outcomes that best serve the ends of justice. Maybe that's true, but what is clear is that prosecutorial discretion is the largest driver of the criminal justice system. Prosecutors enjoy absolute immunity in deciding not to charge, in deciding to refer a case to a community-based restorative resolution, in electing to charge, but then kick the case out of court to a restorative program, or in deciding to pursue a conviction. Prosecutors decide what charge to bring, whether to negotiate a plea agreement, what the terms are of that agreement, whether to amend the charges or not. Prosecutors can threaten to bring even more serious charges if the defendant doesn't accept the terms of the agreement. And at sentencing, if there is no agreement, prosecutors have complete discretion within the parameters of a statute to recommend any sentence that they want. In making all of those discretionary decisions, prosecutors exercise personal judgment, informed by their perspective, their philosophy, their understanding of punishment, their explicit and potentially their implicit biases. What happens in court is largely driven by the personal philosophy of the prosecutor. Now, nobody likes to give up authority or discretion particularly easy, and prosecutors certainly do not either. So what does this have to do with restorative justice programs? What's the interplay between prosecutorial discretion and non-court-based restorative outcomes? Most restorative justice programs, or certainly many restorative justice programs, receive their cases, their referrals from prosecutors. Prosecutors then are the gatekeepers for which cases go to restorative justice. And gatekeeping is such an interesting concept, and thank you, Professor Clark, for helping me think about this. The gatekeeper both lets people into something, but also erects a barrier and keeps people from entering. Prosecutors are the gatekeeper for who does or does not get offered a restorative justice outcome. Prosecutors are the gatekeeper for who can resolve a case in the community without a conviction and who goes to court and will most likely end up with a conviction. Since that's a discretionary decision, that means that the personal biases and philosophies of the prosecutor are driving who has the opportunity for a community-based outcome. And a prosecutor might decide, consciously or otherwise, that certain types of offenses or certain types of offenders or certain residents of particular communities or neighborhoods or zip codes are or are not appropriate for restorative justice. A prosecutor's perspective, a prosecutor's personal view drives RJ. And any prosecutor who says that their personal view doesn't drive their court decisions is either lying or is naive. Now, I'm not aware of Vermont data that discusses or shows a racial disparity in who gets referred for restorative justice programming. There is national data, and this shouldn't surprise anyone, to show you that people of color are disproportionately precluded from restorative justice out of court resolutions. What we do know in Vermont is that there is substantial disparity in referral rates to restorative justice programming. We haven't broken that down yet by race, but we have broken it down by county. We elect our prosecutors on a county basis. 14 counties in Vermont, 14 elected prosecutors, 14 justice systems. In Windsor County, fully 50% of the misdemeanor cases were referred for an out-of-court restorative resolution. In a northern county in Vermont, a mere 17% of the misdemeanor cases were referred for an out-of-court restorative response. Was there a difference between the nature of the offenses? Absolutely not. The difference was the philosophy, the bias, the perspective of the prosecutor. If we are searching for a justice system that seeks to combat systemic racism, if we are seeking to eliminate or minimize disparate outcomes based upon location and geography, we need to better understand prosecutorial discretion. And perhaps we need to find a way to modify or maybe limit that discretion. Let me close with this. In classic do as I say but not as I do fashion, after I prepared my remarks for this evening, I thought I'd do some research. And I went online to see what materials there were about prosecutorial discretion. One of the things I found was a recorded lecture by a visiting Yale law professor, Stephen Bright. And Stephen Bright, Professor Bright, discussed the problems and issues related to prosecutorial discretion at the high end in capital cases, in death penalty cases. And even though he was talking about cases at the high end, and I'm talking about generally less serious cases, misdemeanors, all cases are serious, what Professor Bright had to say and what I've shared with you this evening is remarkably similar. I wanted to make that disclosure. I will tell you that I was not aware of what Professor Bright had to say when I prepared my remarks. I'm abundantly confident that in 2014, Professor Bright was not aware of what I was going to say this evening, but I did want to commend to you his recorded lecture, and there's a significant amount of material about some of the risks of prosecutorial discretion available on the web. And with that, I think I will turn it back to Professor Clark, but hope to answer some questions later on.
Thank you, Professor Sand. With that, we will turn to Attorney Robinson.
Thank you, Professor Clark, and to the student ambassadors, to Commissioner Title, Professor Sand, and Dean Shirley Jefferson. This has been a pleasure already to share this time with you all and to learn from you all, and I look forward to further conversation a bit later on. What I'm going to do, Professor Sand, I'll also be a little unorthodox, and I will sort of do my own thing and share my screen because I did create a deck for this presentation, so give me a second. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about embedded racism, police, and accountability. And as you all know, it's a conversation that many people are having right now as we open our newspapers, we watch the news, and we see yet again, over and over and over again, another Black person or person of color who has been harmed by police violence. And so I thought to make that a part of the conversation today, not because restorative justice can answer every question that we might have about police brutality, but because I think it should be a part of the conversation that we ultimately have. And so just to set the pace, let's start out with a discussion about what police brutality actually means. And so here's one definition that says, although excessive physical force is often what one thinks of when considering police brutality, the definition also extends to false arrest, to verbal abuse, unnecessary intimidation, and racial profiling. And so I say that because in large part, some of the conversation that we're having, or that I'll be having, is about the extremes, but I don't want any of you, any of us to lose account of those other cases that don't lead to a person's death or a person being seriously injured. And so what is at stake? What is at stake? Well, we can't have a conversation without talking about the many Black lives that we lose. And I rest on these faces. Of course, when you're making quick editorial decisions, you know, I thought to put them in black and white, but I wanted them to be in color, and I wanted you to see their personalities and to see that they are friends, they are family members, they're loved ones, and for many of us in our own homes, in our communities, we identify with them as if they are members of our own family. And I think that's because we know that their fates could have happened to us or to members, or to our own family members. And so I want to say their names, and it's unfortunate that I won't be getting into their stories, but we've heard their stories. And the only reason I won't touch on them is because they're much more vast than anything we've heard in the media, and certainly than anything that I can tell you about them. But we've heard the name Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, Eric Garner, found a young picture of Eric Garner, Stephen Clark, and Elijah McClain. Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police violence than their white counterparts. And that's just a fact that our country is coming to grips with. I think we see that narrative play out, but 3 times more likely is not where we can rest as a country. None of us should be okay with that. And this is from a study from Mapping Police, or called Mapping Police Violence, from 2019. What I have here is a document to show the response to police violence, right? And so this becomes a really, really big point of contention, because you'll see that only 1% of police killings result in charges. And so many of those that we're seeing on television, certainly it happened in Breonna Taylor's case, there's this conversation about what should happen to the officers. And I just frame this to say that there are many officers out there, many cases that you'll never hear about one way or the other, where there is no perceived accountability. And so I raise that because even in teaching my course on race, crimes, and restorative justice, there always comes into the classroom and to the conversation, what should happen to police officers? Can we actually consider a restorative frame and want something to happen to police officers? And certainly I believe that you can. It is what is that something becomes the issue, and something that our society should grapple with. And I think restorative justice helps us get there. In 2017, there were 1,147 people killed by police officers. 92% were killed by police shootings. The majority of the rest were made up of tasers, or happened because of tasers and other physical force. But outside of talking about the physical violence and the lost lives, we cannot have this conversation about the impact of police brutality without talking about another thing that is at stake for us, and it is outcomes for Black and brown communities. And that comes in the way of trauma. So trauma has certainly an impact on our lives. The discussion of the potential psychological and physical impact upon individuals is what we're talking about here. Desmond Ong, a public policy professor at Harvard, found that among African American and Latinx high school students, exposure to localized police violence and the shootings of unarmed suspects led to a decrease in grade point average, increased incidence of emotional disturbance, and lowered rates of high school completion. And so I say this as someone who has also felt the hurt and the pain of police violence. And I think in a different way than some people in our society, the reality is it does have an impact, and it can have a long-standing impact on our well-being as communities and our outcomes in those communities. What has been shown as the response to some of these very public incidents of police violence has been an unfavorable attitudes toward police officers. And the reason this is relevant is because we think of police officers as having a responsibility to us and to communities. But what happens when you fear those police officers? What happens when you believe that those institutions are rife with discrimination? And what happens when you don't trust those institutions? Certainly a reasonable response to some of the things that we've seen. And so I land here on, and certainly I can't summarize the feelings of entire communities. If we had the time, I would certainly, I think many of you in the audience have feelings and thoughts that you could add to this list. But I just highlight a few things that I've heard through the last several months from colleagues, from friends, from students who sort of feel like they're at their wits' end, right? Enough is enough. It is wearing. Another was, I'm not okay today, which I think is really, really interesting because there's this moment of not leaning in, of saying this is not okay, and also saying that I acknowledge that this is impacting me and my community and my family in a way that won't easily be overcome. And so that leads us to a conversation about what we can do. What does progress look like? How can we get around some of these troubles? And I'll note that for people of color, and particularly for Black people, it is difficult to have this conversation in a moment where we see people killed actually in the streets. We see videos of this. And I should say, and I shouldn't have to say, of course, there is no indication, obviously, that all officers are bad officers. And I think that's what happens when we get into this conversation. We sort of are pulled to one polar side or the next to sort of decide how we feel. And the reality is, the most important part from my perspective is having the conversation. And so that's why restorative justice to me feels like something that is important to bring into the conversation. What does progress look like? I raise here just briefly the Tulsa Race Massacre, which took place in May 31st and June 1st of 1921. And that was when mobs of people were deputized, given weapons, and attacked Black residents and businesses in the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, obviously, a little bit different than some of the things that we're dealing with today, but I'll note that 36 people died in that race massacre. 26 people were Black, 10 were white, and historians have said that there might even be as many as 300 people who have died. But I raise it because of what happened after those couple of days. So in the years after that, we saw that Black Tulsans worked to rebuild ruined communities, that segregation became rife in the city, and that Oklahoma's newly established branch of the Ku Klux Klan grew in strength and in power. Tulsa, again, became very segregated. 41% of the Black population lived in the lower income area. And outcomes for the city did not improve continue to be an issue in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so what didn't happen was the conversation. And so that leads us to, what does progress look like? Instead of perpetuating an endless cycle of harm, restorative justice seeks to interrupt it, to heal the harm and repair the damage to relationships. That's a quote from Dr. Fania Davis. The reason I love this quote is, to me, I sort of summarize it as doing something different, right? We have done policy reform, and please understand, I believe in changing policies, but I believe that restorative justice can be a bigger part of that conversation. We've realized that our criminal legal system that we have today is the result of some policy reform, right? So we have to make sure that whatever policies we advance in the future, whether you're an abolitionist or whether you have more incremental goals for how we can do justice in our society, that conversation needs to be had. And restorative justice gives us a framework for that conversation. So focusing on the victims and community needs, that's a big part of this conversation. Assessing the obligations from the harm. So the harms from police brutality is certainly most readily felt by family members of those people who are harmed and killed. But there's secondary trauma to many, many people in our society. And so what does it look like to assess those harms? And then engagement, which is always a very, very important step, that we have to have this conversation together, and that we have to be inclusive and figure out an approach. I think the tenets of restorative justice would say that we lay out the framework and we allow communities to determine how to walk through these steps. And I think that's important too, because the trauma of witnessing police brutality certainly doesn't go away immediately. And so creating some space for people to determine how we come to that table, when we come to that table, to figure out what we want as a result of meeting at that table. And so I leave you with just a quote from Dr. Davis, but it's one that she borrowed from Dr. King, Dr. Martin Luther King, that framed for her what justice looks like. And she said that justice is love, correcting that which stands against love. And again, that brings me back to the responsibility and the opportunity to do something different. And it might feel a little bit different, and it should feel a little bit different than the way we've achieved change in the past. But I believe that restorative justice creates a great opportunity for us to engage with the real issues. And they go to what we've been talking about today: embedded racism within many of our institutions, including the criminal legal system, but others, as well as the disparate impact that racism has on people who are valuable in our communities and in our society. And so with that, I will toss it back to Professor Clark and look forward to our ongoing conversation.
Thank you so much, Attorney Robinson. And I have to say, such appreciation for all three of you and what you've shared already. And we definitely have questions coming through in our chat. And I also have a few questions, and I'll start by coming back to you, Commissioner Title. How does Vermont's new marijuana law fit in the national drug reform and marijuana decriminalization context?
Well, let me first say, speaking on my own behalf, not on behalf of my agency, and I have not had a chance to read the actual law yet, so I'm going off of media reports. So with that caveat, there's a couple of things that I think are really good. One is that the board, as I mentioned, is independent, like Massachusetts. That's actually pretty unique. In most states, It's not an independent board. And so I think that really allows for better decision making if the people on the board are diverse and have integrity. And I think it also allows for more direct influence by citizens and by organizations who feel strongly. So that is a great start. And then already a known culture, at least looking from the outside in Vermont, for a preference for local product and a strong consumer culture that prefers local products. That makes a big difference. And then I read that there is a cap for one retail location for the companies that are grandfathered in. And those kinds of caps are really good because they prevent domination and exploitation by a small number of companies. But there were two things that I read that really made my heart sink, and I want to share them with you because they are very much repeating the mistakes that I saw in Massachusetts. And one is the amount of local control. That is really what hurt us so badly here, because at the state level, we have to be equitable as an agency, but every business needs both state approval and some form of local approval. And the cities and towns don't have to be equitable. They don't have the time to become experts. They're dealing with a new, to them, often scary issue. And it's just a complete recipe for inherent bias. There are also companies that are buying their way into local licenses here. I have no doubt that will happen in Vermont as well if it's not stopped. And so I would very much encourage you to talk to your local officials now about marijuana and cannabis in general, but especially that you want the market to be equitable and to serve a repair, what's the word I'm looking for? Reparable, equitable purpose. That is so important. I would say that's the number one piece of advice I can give you if you're in Vermont. And then the other thing is that I read there's priority for minority-owned businesses. That also sunk us in Massachusetts. And I usually don't even mention it when I talk about the equity program, and I didn't today, because this was something in our statute where the law gave supposedly equal preference to the existing large, well-funded, well-resourced medical dispensaries, and then communities that have just been disproportionately harmed. And that's really, if you look at if you think about the difference between equity, where you're making things fair and making a level playing field, and equality, where you're just treating everybody the same, this was exactly an example of that, because almost all of the companies that took advantage of that priority in the first couple of years were the medical dispensaries, and the others were not able to do it because the barriers were too high and we hadn't addressed those barriers. And from what I've read, it's the same situation in Vermont. But if you lobby as hard as you can, the governor who is appointing the new cannabis board and the nominating committee that's appointing that board, and you say that you want people with this experience, everything that Anton just went through in terms of restorative justice and decision making by people who understand these issues, if you have them on the board, that's going to make a huge difference. And then lobby the members directly. They will have all of the power to create this in a way that can avoid those problems.
Thank you so much. And I do want to clarify my own question, which was that I referred to the marijuana legalization, but it is referred in the bill as cannabis. So I just want to make sure that I correct myself. Thank you very much. Professor Sand, you discussed challenges involving the discretion, particularly with prosecutors, but also just within the current criminal legal system. Is there a better alternative, and what would it be?
Some thoughts, and specifically as it relates to RJ programs, restorative justice programs that are tied to the criminal system. First of all, we've dramatically over-criminalized behavior in this country, and we've divested communities of the ability and the skill set and the necessity to resolve disputes locally. So we have outsourced our response to harm to centralized entities who are dramatically removed and divorced from the location where the harm occurred. So step one, I think, is figuring out how to decriminalize or remove a pretty broad swath of what is presently criminal. Second, and perhaps controversially, so I suggested that referrals to restorative justice programs are in the discretion of the DA, and that there's great disparities in how DAs make those referrals. I think we need to change that. And I think we need to mandate legislatively that for particular types of offenses, let's start by saying misdemeanors, all of those cases have to begin with a community-based restorative justice response. And only if there isn't a successful outcome, however we define that, at the community level, does it then become legitimate for a prosecutor to file those charges. Prosecutors will go ballistic at that. I think law enforcement will not be particularly wild about it. An alternative approach is to simply say that trial courts do not have jurisdiction over misdemeanors unless and until an effort has been made to resolve the dispute through a restorative justice approach. Dramatically lowering caseloads, lowering cost, better outcomes, and far fewer people stigmatized, often for life, with a criminal conviction. We have to try to elect prosecutors who give a damn about this issue. I will leave it at that. And fourth item, and probably most controversially, we elect our DAs, we elect our prosecutors. We might think about a system of appointing prosecutors. We would end up with greater uniformity. What we would lose is the county as a laboratory. So Professor Clark, you and I worked on creating a DUI treatment court in Windsor County. That's the only one in the state. If we appoint prosecutors and create greater uniformity, we might lose some of that innovation, but we might also be able to develop more consistent responses. So we don't have County A that is taking a progressive approach to restorative justice and County B that has a purely punitive response and doesn't believe in that outcome. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Attorney Robinson, how can communities and their law enforcement agencies approach the conversation about racial discrimination and policing safely and without furthering the divide that exists?
Sure. I think communities should know that they have an inroad with police officers. I think that includes community policing. So we have to know that police officers actually have a stake in those communities. In many instances, that is some requirement that they're near those communities or live near those communities. The reality is we need people who care about those communities. And we also need to foster an environment where there is a way to have your voice heard. As a public defender, I think that was the thing that was hardest to hear from some of my clients. Many of them wanted to have real conversations with the officers, like they had this sense that the officer didn't realize how screwed up some of the things that they experienced were. They wanted to, even someone feeling wronged, like in the midst of that, wanted the officer to just understand their perspective. And so whatever we can do to create the space so that officers can understand the community's perspective, as officers serve communities, like that's their job. Whatever we can do to create that space in that community is important, and we should start working on that immediately. There are some models that allow people into police precincts to actually file complaints against officers. There's certainly citizens complaints board and so forth. Like there are options like that, but I think we have to ground that in we need solutions. And this is this is a conversation that we're all invited to. My perspective is as important as yours. And I want you to understand who I am and the perspective that I'm coming from and what my community needs. And then I can't touch on that without talking about the defund movement, one that seeks to take money away from police budgets and to then move some of that money into communities. You know, again, I don't think that ideas like that are at odds with restorative justice principles. What I think is we can sort of get lost in those ideas and not also couple them with the necessary restorative goals that we have and responses that we have. So sure, in New York, for example, I think the budget that was passed this year it shaved off $1 billion out of $11 billion of an annual budget for the NYPD, right? And the goal is to get some of that money to the communities that need it. But that alone, like that little bit alone, while it might get us closer to a smaller NYPD, which many people would not complain about, we also have to couple that with the conversation that communities want to have, and we have to do it in terms that are not that aren't harmful to those communities, that aren't intimidating to those communities, and that say we really, really value your perspective.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up question, and that is, and also to you, Attorney Robinson, but are there effective ways to address conflicts with police officers in cases that don't end as tragically?
Sure. So, you know, it sort of is related to the conversation in that there are circles. I mean, like there really is in some jurisdictions a circle process that include officers and people in the community. So if there is a dispute, they have an opportunity to speak with an officer, and those circles have been shown to have benefits to citizens. So people who have complaints, there's a greater opportunity to meet the goals, greater satisfaction with the complaint process, better understanding of policing and empowerment. And then there's benefits for police accountability as well. So greater responsibility for one's actions and positive changes in police subculture. So it's just they're taking the principles of restorative justice and applying them in places where we haven't seen them before, which I think is important to help us get past or to really acknowledge rather some of the racist ideals that have been at play in many systems that we interact with every day. I think that is why I framed a lot of my conversation about the conversation, because we can't run away from the conversation that needs to be had. Like we really need to have a conversation about race. That's why this conversation that we're all having today and with the audience is so important. But we should not be afraid to have them in more spaces and be open and honest and to meet each other wherever we can meet each other in these conversations. And I say that too, not because it always feels good to have that conversation. It certainly wouldn't feel good for people who love Breonna Taylor to have that conversation right now. So I don't say that, and I'm conscious of the extra obligation that some people might have in that conversation. And so I just acknowledge that it should be on their terms as well. They should be guiding what this conversation looks like, what they need to appear at this proverbial table or in this circle, and sort of encourage us all to really, really go there and for once acknowledge how race has impacted systems and to start to break away at its hold on our systems.
Thank you. I want to remind our audience that I'm going to be starting to take their questions also from the chat. And if anyone just needs the reminder that the place to put your questions is in the icon on the live stream in your top right-hand corner of your screen. And you can also put questions directly into our Facebook page as well. And I'm going to turn to some of those questions now. And this one is pertinent to Vermont, and it's and this, I think, Professor Sand, is to you. What are your perspectives on the new Vermont bills, specifically Senate 119, 234, 54, 124, and 24? I'm sure you have those all memorized and just right at the front of your mind, but related specifically to accountability, racial justice, and criminal law reform.
I feel like I want to know who asked that question, because I do not have all the numbers committed to memory. There was a time when I used to live under the Gold Dome, and I would. Certainly, so Commissioner Title talked about the marijuana bill. It's interesting that it passed the House and Senate. There was an effort by a racial justice group to have the governor veto the bill because it didn't go far enough to address systemic disparities and the disproportionate impact of the war on drugs on people of color. And ultimately, the governor decided to allow it to become law without his signature. As a matter of advocacy, I think the progression to our tax and regulate model has been interesting, because first Vermont decriminalized, so removed criminal penalties, though it was still illegal. Then we legalized personal possession, and now we're moving to a regulated, lawful model that doesn't take effect until May of 2022, I believe, with some preference to the existing medical dispensaries, part of the issue that was causing people concern. There's broad effort to redefine police use of force standards. I know that the Attorney General is spearheading an effort through one of those bills, I'm not sure which number, to look at models of civilian oversight for law enforcement. And actually, the VLS Center for Justice Reform is included in that bill as an entity with whom our Attorney General is to consult. I think the legislature is really making a good faith effort to figure out how to shape the laws in a way that will bend the arc in a more fair and just fashion. It's not easy, and I know I'm slightly dodging because I just haven't committed all the bills either by number or by substance to memory, but if there's a specific follow-up, happy to try to answer that as well.
Thank you. Attorney Robinson, are you able to share where the audience might learn more about the jurisdictions where circles are being used with police and community members?
Sure. So the ACLU has done some work on that very issue. And the expert that I'm thinking of is Samuel Walker. So look for Samuel Walker. There's a report that is entitled Mediating Citizen Complaints Against Police Officers, a guide for police and community leaders. It talks about some intervention in Nebraska. New York City also has, if you look at ACLU of New York City, you should see some information about the CCRB. So the Citizen Complaint Review Board has broad authority, or ever increasing authority as well. But Dr. Samuel Walker has really led the way in some of the research. So I would start there to take a look at some of the other jurisdictions that do it.
Thank you. Do laws or prosecutorial discretion that make crimes against civil servants more egregious, perpetuating the us versus them mentality? Do we remove those laws, or do we add laws that make crimes perpetuated by our civil servants more egregious? Shall I read it again? You're muted. Professor Sand.
I was muted to read that. I think it's a really interesting question, which I am also going to slightly dodge, whether the status of the harmed party, the victim, should influence the outcome. So it is absolutely true that there are enhancements for assaults on law enforcement officers or corrections officers or other public safety officials. And I think the biggest flaw with those laws is that we think ratcheting up penalties is going to serve as a more effective deterrent. And I don't think punishment is a particularly effective deterrent. So it's a very easy legislative response to show how tough the legislature is to start cranking up penalties, whether that's for drug offenses, whether that's for crimes against civil servants. It doesn't change behavior. Figuring out a relational response using a fundamentally different approach to harm is likely going to be a far better way to reduce recidivism rates than ratcheting up penalties. And I don't know how we hold legislators accountable to result-based lawmaking. Over and over and over, penalties get increased, but we don't have the results to show that those increased penalties served any function other than perpetuating otherness of people who come into the system, particularly people of color.
So relevant to that is another question, and that is, and I think this is for anyone though, and that's that evidence shows that restorative justice is most impactful with serious crimes, which likely need to go through the criminal legal process. How can we as a state, or I would say any jurisdiction, begin to work toward making a restorative process available for those serious crimes? And I will just personally reflect that I think it's not easy. And this is a place where, you know, buy-in becomes critical. And that means that there have to be people willing to be vulnerable and share their voice when they've gone through a process and it's been a serious crime and there's been an outcome that they're willing to share so that people can see the impact of that and they can understand the power of that. But I think that it starts with having to at least see one of those outcomes to understand that and what it can do and how transformative it can be. And it's conversations about really, I think, transformative justice. And I'll let the panelists speak too.
I have a thought, and I would want to pick up on something that Professor Robinson said, and that is that communities need to learn how to engage in dialogue when there isn't harm at issue. So using circles to build community so that they are skilled and equipped to sit in circle when there is harm. And I think communities will be more willing to have what we might call higher end offenses go to a restorative process when the communities have learned the value of sitting in circle. Legislators are protective of not sending so-called high-end offenses to RJ responses because they think there's political exposure for them. When communities start demanding the opportunity to do that, I think the legislators will get over their aversion. There is some shift in thinking about this. One of the reasons that the law school's master's program has a course on new approaches to domestic and sexual violence is that historically was an area where RJ was off the table, and increasingly, largely because victims are unhappy. The harmed party is unhappy with the conventional response. We are starting to see movement toward using restorative responses to crimes of interpersonal violence.
I think I just want to add, I think Professor Sand, you hit the nail on the head there. It is about also what victims need and what complainants need in cases. And if you have a real commitment to those needs, like you have to establish that commitment like on the front end before people will even be able to come to a circle or believe in it or know its power. You have to say, we actually really care about your circumstances. We really care about your outcomes. And so I think to your conversation earlier, I think that is also relevant, something that our DA's offices and prosecutors can help with as well. Gone is the day that you can have a victim services representative, right? We have to be very, very multifaceted and really figuring out what the needs are of those communities. We know that as many communities also are victimized by people in those communities or from other communities as well. And to have a real commitment to their needs would go a long way to say, we're ready for this conversation.
Thank you. It does make me think that we've gotten to this place where, because our adversarial system and retributive responses in society and in our communities, we've forgotten what Kay Pranis has taught us in terms of circles, and that every single person on this planet, if you trace back far enough in your own family history, you have family members who sat in circle to take care of problems and to deal with conflict and to heal and repair. And they didn't have what today we have, is this idea that we can send somebody away, we can isolate out, instead of saying, no, we need this person in our community. We rely on each other. We understand that we have to rely on our connections and our relationships to succeed and survive. And today we don't have that. And I think it's so important to have those processes reintroduced to communities, because when they're experienced, I think people really understand just how they resonate and lead to better outcomes. I'll move on. I think, Professor Sand, did you want to ask a question?
I was wondering, thank you, for Commissioner Title, if you were Supreme Commander of the universe and could change one thing about the Massachusetts cannabis law, what would that be?
That's a great question. I don't know if I'm being influenced by this conversation, but I think I would actually say this anyways. So one thing that I struggle with is I'm the only person of color on the commission, and it definitely feels challenging and tokenizing, and it's a real struggle sometimes just to like get across basic concepts that I don't think I would have to do if there was at least one other person of color. But we have, and another thing is that municipal and state officials in Massachusetts have found a way to get tax revenue and parts of business revenue to police. They have like twisted every single part of the law to get them money, and then more money, and then more money on top of the caps, and then more money from the businesses, and everyone just looks away. When I fight for things that are just already included in the law to be implemented. I've had articles written about me that I'm inappropriately acting as an advocate. I've had people ask to talk to my supervisor, and I have to tell them I don't have a supervisor. I work directly for the people, and all of these things that the people who are getting money to police have never had to deal with. The thing I would change is that if I could just get people who are in decision-making positions and positions of authority to just sit down with people who have been victims of the drug war and talk to them and understand their situations. I really think that they would, in every decision that they make throughout the day, just think about them, think about benefiting them the way that they think about police. And I think all of those small decisions would add up. And it really just takes like getting those conversations and the awareness, that they exist, and like just have them taking the space in their head that police currently take up.
Thanks.
Thanks for asking.
Thank you. So I'm mindful of time, and I'm going to ask another question from our chat. So, and this is for anyone. So, would the format and structure of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission be one example of how to combine restorative justice principles with addressing past and present injustice?
Would you read it one more time?
Certainly. Would the format and structure of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission be one example of how to combine restorative justice principles with addressing past and present injustice?
So I would say yes, but I also find that just creating another commission can be a form of avoidance sometimes, and just like shoving the problem over, to a kiddie table and never having to deal with it. So I think incorporating truth and reconciliation aspects into the actual decision making would be even better. When you're, for example, working on more diversity in an organization, you can sometimes have a rule where the interviewers have to be a panel and people on the panel have to be each looking from a different aspect, and then they get back together afterwards to make a discussion, and one person is like watching and looking for bias. If you had something similar where one person was specifically in the role of truth and reconciliation and like stopping the conversation when it was leaving that out, I think that would be a great idea.
I mean,
Other
briefly,
thoughts?
I'm into of it. I think it's, as a principle, it's an idea that we can sort of corral around a little bit more as a society, and we should. I think we'll shake out sort of what that looks like, but I think it's important to have those conversations and to really acknowledge the harm from the past. So on the front end, I think any way that we get to those very important conversations, no matter the infrastructure on the front end, I think it's important for us to acknowledge people's pain, both past and present.
I'll just say a certain coincidence to that question, because we began a dialogue, some folks at VLS today, about developing a course on truth and reconciliation. And there are many different models. I know Maine held a statewide truth and reconciliation with their indigenous population. And actually former Professor Bruce Dutu was involved in a film about that process called Dawnland. I don't know how we have the conversations that Professor Robinson has been talking about until we acknowledge the harm that we have caused, and a TNR process that is really transparent and is structured in a way to have those hard conversations seems to be an important thing for us to do.
And I would only add to have those conversations in a way that is safe for everyone involved. That brings us to the end of this evening. I just want to say special thanks to Commissioner Title, Attorney Robinson, Professor Sand, and to everyone in our audience tonight. We appreciate spending this time with you. Thank you and be well.
Thanks, everyone.